Do you ever envision a time of just ceasing being the Beatles and going off on your own, or even working together?
We do work on our own anyway now.
You never can be anything else but the Beatles.
We are the Beatles, that's what we are.
The bond between Paul McCartney and John Lennon stands as one of music's most captivating friendships. From Liverpool teenagers to global icons, their relationship evolved through creative brilliance, artistic rivalry, and profound understanding. Their journey together shaped not just the Beatles, but the entire landscape of popular music. Their story transcended partnership, touching millions with its raw humanity and artistic genius. The abrupt end in December 1980 left an indelible mark on music history. Join us as we explore the touching final moments and conversations between these two musical legends. The last night together. In the fading light of 1976, amidst the bustling energy of New York City, an unremarkable evening became etched in music history. The Beatles had been dissolved for years, their legendary partnership scattered to the winds of solo careers and individual pursuits. Paul McCartney had found success with Wings, while John Lennon had embraced his role as a cultural revolutionary. The Dakota Hotel, an imposing structure standing sentinel over Central Park, became the unlikely stage for what would be their final meeting. On this particular evening, the two former Beatles found themselves sharing a couch watching Saturday Night Live together. The simple act of enjoying television together spoke volumes about how far they'd come from the bitter aftermath of their band's breakup. The weight of lawsuits, public feuds, and harsh words had gradually lifted. It allowed their natural camaraderie to resurface. The evening unfolded with the comfortable familiarity that only decades of friendship could foster. Behind closed doors, away from the prying eyes of the media and the expectations of fans, they were simply Paul and John again, two lads from Liverpool who had once dreamed of making music together. As the night drew to a close, neither man could have known the significance this casual gathering would hold. Standing at the threshold of the Dakota, McCartney prepared to leave, carrying with him what would become their final moments together. In a gesture that haunted music history, he turned to his old friend with parting words that seemed to bridge their past differences and acknowledge their enduring connection. Those words about remembering an old friend later took on an almost prophetic quality, becoming a poignant reminder of their unbreakable bond that transcended their professional difficulties and personal disagreements. From bread to brotherhood, the final phone call. In the months leading up to December 1980, amid the swirling chaos of their separate musical careers and personal lives, a remarkably ordinary conversation became an extraordinary final connection between two old friends. The phone call between Paul McCartney and John Lennon centered around something surprisingly domestic: the art of baking bread. The conversation emerged during a period of relative calm in both their lives. Lennon had recently emerged from his self-imposed musical hiatus, releasing Double Fantasy with Yoko Ono, while McCartney was enjoying continued success with Wings. Their earlier tensions had mellowed into a comfortable friendship, allowing them to share simple pleasures like comparing notes on homemade bread recipes and baking techniques. This seemingly mundane exchange carried profound significance beneath its surface. Gone were the complicated discussions about business dealings, artistic differences, and band politics that had once dominated their interactions. Instead, they found themselves sharing tips about yeast and flour, discussing the simple satisfaction of creating something with their hands, a far cry from the complex musical masterpieces they had once crafted together. The domesticity of their final conversation revealed how far both men had come from their days as cultural revolutionaries. They had evolved into family men who found joy in life's simpler pleasures, their former rivalry replaced by a mature appreciation for each other's company, even if only through a telephone line. The transformation from musical partners to fellow bread enthusiasts symbolized a full-circle moment in their relationship. Neither could have anticipated the weight this ordinary conversation would carry in the years to come. The image of two former Beatles who had once changed the face of popular music, discussing the intricacies of bread making, later became a touching reminder of their reconciliation and enduring connection. This final phone call, with a focus on the simple pleasures of domestic life, served as a poignant bookend to their decades-long relationship. The day the music died, learning of the loss. The morning of December 9, 1980, began like any other at Paul McCartney's farmhouse in the Scottish countryside. The peaceful routine of rural life had become a cherished constant for the musician, a stark contrast to the whirlwind decades of his earlier career. But within moments, the ordinary morning transformed into one of the darkest days in music history. The telephone's ring pierced the morning calm. The message was brief but devastating. John Lennon had been shot outside his New York home. The impact of the words hit McCartney with the force of a physical blow, leaving him struggling to process the unthinkable reality that his oldest friend, his former bandmate, his musical brother, was gone. In the immediate aftermath, McCartney faced the heart-wrenching task of sharing the news with his wife Linda and their children. The family had known John not just as a musical legend, but as a familiar presence in their lives, making the loss deeply personal for each of them. The weight fell heavily on Paul's shoulders as he struggled to find words that could convey the devastating news. The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of disbelief and sorrow. News crews gathered outside the farmhouse, their presence a stark reminder that this private grief was also a public event. But within the walls of his home, McCartney grappled with emotions far removed from his public persona. His thoughts repeatedly returned to the senselessness of the act, the waste of such extraordinary talent, and the profound loss of potential future reconciliations and collaborations. The raw emotion of that morning stayed with McCartney for decades, coloring his memories and influencing his music. His anger towards the perpetrator remained undiminished by time, a testament to the depth of his loss. The day marked not just the end of John Lennon's life, but the definitive conclusion of an era, closing the door on any possibility of a future Beatles reunion and forever altering the landscape of popular music. Musical tributes and lasting legacy. In the wake of John Lennon's tragic passing, Paul McCartney found himself navigating the complex terrain of grief through the universal language they had always shared, music. The years following 1980 saw the emergence of several deeply personal tributes, each carrying the weight of decades of shared history and unspoken words. These musical offerings became McCartney's way of processing his loss while simultaneously celebrating the extraordinary partnership that had changed the landscape of popular music forever. The first of these tributes emerged in 1982 with the release of Here Today, a haunting melody that captured the essence of their complicated relationship. The song's creation process proved emotionally challenging for McCartney, who found himself confronting memories spanning from their teenage years in Liverpool to their final conversations about bread making. Through carefully crafted verses and melodies, he managed to convey both the joy of their friendship and the profound depth of his loss. Throughout the subsequent decades, McCartney's performances of Lennon's songs during his concerts evolved into powerful moments of collective remembrance. These renditions, particularly of Give Peace a Chance and Imagine, transformed from simple covers into deeply moving tributes. The legacy of their partnership continued to influence McCartney's creative process long after Lennon's death. In numerous interviews and documentaries, he revealed how he would occasionally find himself considering Lennon's potential opinions while composing new music, maintaining a sort of spiritual collaboration that transcended physical boundaries. This invisible dialogue manifested in subtle musical choices and lyrical decisions that echoed their former creative synergy. As years passed, McCartney's public remembrances of Lennon evolved from expressions of raw grief into celebrations of their shared history. Life and legacy. John Lennon's story transcends the boundaries of fame. It's an odyssey of transformation, boundless creativity, and an unwavering commitment to instigate change. Born October 9, 1940, in Liverpool, England, Lennon's formative years were riddled with familial discord and an aura of uncertainty. However, these tumultuous times didn't dampen his spirit. Instead, they fueled his refuge in music, a sanctuary that not only defined his existence, but also left an indelible mark on the world. The journey to stardom for Lennon began with the Beatles, a band destined to revolutionize the soundscape of popular music. As a visionary songwriter and charismatic co-lead vocalist, Lennon, in collaboration with Paul McCartney, forged one of the most iconic and successful songwriting duos ever. The Beatles' ascent to stardom in the swinging 60s was nothing short of astronomical. With timeless classics like Help, Yesterday, and Let It Be, they didn't just create music, they became the beating heart of a cultural renaissance, capturing the imaginations and hearts of millions across the globe. But Lennon's identity was not confined to being a Beatle. His solo career, heralded by masterpieces like Imagine and John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, unraveled the layers of his artistry. His songs became mirrors reflecting his innermost thoughts and philosophies, often intertwined with themes of peace, love, and a fervent call for social justice. Lennon bravely wielded his fame as a platform for activism, emerging as a pivotal figure in the anti-war crusade and other humanitarian causes. Equally significant in his life was his partnership with Yoko Ono, a fusion of romantic and artistic endeavors that defied the norms of their era. Together, they became symbols of peace and love, staging bed-ins for peace and collaborating on numerous artistic projects. John's life and career were a tapestry of pioneering music, spearheading cultural movements, and a relentless pursuit of a utopian world. His unwavering message of hope and unity, embedded in his music and his actions, continues to resonate and inspire. Even decades after his tragic departure, Lennon's legacy lives on, echoing through the corridors of time. The tragic end. December 8, 1980 marks a dark chapter in the history of music, the day when the world lost John Lennon in the most tragic of circumstances. Lennon's life, filled with music, love, and activism, was abruptly and brutally ended outside the Dakota, his New York City apartment building. That evening, as Lennon returned home with Yoko Ono, he was confronted by Mark David Chapman, a man who had once admired Lennon but had grown disillusioned. In a chilling turn of events, Chapman shot Lennon 4 times in the back. The shooting was not just an attack on Lennon, but a blow to the ideals he stood for: peace, love, and understanding. Lennon was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, but the injuries were too severe. The news of his death sent shockwaves around the world. Fans gathered in spontaneous vigils, mourning the loss of an icon who had shaped the cultural and musical landscape of the era. The act of violence brought an end to Lennon's journey, but it couldn't silence his message. Even in his absence, Lennon's legacy continues to live on. His music and ideals still echoing in the hearts of millions. The world lost a symbol that day of hope and a voice for change. John Lennon's haunting final words. The final words of John Lennon, uttered mere moments after he was tragically shot outside his New York City apartment, have been a subject of much speculation and sorrow for decades. Now, 43 years after his untimely death, new insights into those last moments provide a deeper understanding of the tragedy that unfolded December 8, 1980. John was just 40 at the time and was returning to his apartment in the Dakota, a landmark building in Manhattan's Upper West Side, after a recording session with Yoko Ono. This session, of course, would unknowingly be his last. Jay Hastings, working as a concierge at the Dakota, witnessed the harrowing moments that followed. As Lennon staggered past him, bleeding and in shock, he uttered, "I'm shot," before collapsing. Hastings recalls Lennon's blood coming out of his mouth as he collapsed on the floor. In a frantic state, Hastings half-rolled Lennon onto his back, removing his glasses, while Yoko's screams for an ambulance pierced the night. The shooter, Mark David Chapman, had earlier that day encountered Lennon, asking him to autograph a copy of the album Double Fantasy, recorded with Ono. Hours later, Chapman, battling his own mental health challenges, committed to the irreversible act. In his confession, Chapman described a voice in his head urging him to do it, do it. This chilling command led him to fire 5 shots with a .38 caliber handgun, hitting Lennon 4 times in the back. A nearby taxi driver, Richard Peterson, witnessed the shooting, initially mistaking it for a movie scene, not realizing the gravity of what he was seeing until it was tragically too late. Chapman, after the shooting, sat down on a nearby curb, reading The Catcher in the Rye until his arrest. He later pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 20 years to life sentence at Greenhaven Correctional Facility in New York. Lennon's final words, simple yet heart-wrenching, reflected the suddenness and brutality of his death. They stand as a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the profound impact of a single moment. His passing left the world in mourning, as fans and fellow artists grappled with the loss of a music icon who had championed peace and love. The night of Lennon's death marked not just a personal tragedy for his family and friends, but a collective heartbreak for his global fan base. His music, which had always resonated with themes of hope and humanity, suddenly took on a new depth of poignancy. The man who had asked the world to imagine a place of harmony was taken in an act of senseless violence. In the days and weeks that followed, tributes poured in from around the world. Vigils were held, songs were sung, and Lennon's music echoed through streets and homes, a testament to his enduring influence. His former Beatles bandmate Paul McCartney was left speechless when first asked about Lennon's death, later expressing his deep sorrow through music and public statements. Yoko Ono, Lennon's widow, emerged as a figure of strength in the wake of this tragedy. She called for an end to gun violence, urging people to remember Lennon for his message of peace. Her resilience and advocacy kept Lennon's vision alive and inspired many to carry on his legacy. Decades later, the impact of John Lennon's final words and his untimely demise continues to thunder through the music industry and beyond. His life and work remain a powerful influence, inspiring new generations of musicians and peace activists. The rise of Steely Dan in the post-Beatles era.
We never came up with a band of our own that we felt was the right combination of guys, that it was stable. It was just me and Walter. You hear somebody in a record and you say, wow, listen to this guy's a great soloist, let's have him come in and, what would he be good on? What would suit his style? That's the fun.
In 1971, as the dust was still settling from the Beatles' seismic breakup, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker came together to form Steely Dan. Like many bands of their generation, they grew up under the long shadow cast by the Fab Four. The Beatles had left an indelible mark on the musical landscape, and new groups were often measured against their towering legacy. Steely Dan, however, was not content to simply imitate their predecessors. While they admired the Beatles' approach to music making, particularly their decision to focus on studio work rather than touring, Fagen and Becker had their own unique vision. They set out to create what they called special material, a sophisticated blend of rock and jazz that set them apart from their contemporaries. Initially, the band was forced to pay their dues by writing bubblegum pop tunes for artists like Tommy Roe and the Grassroots. But as they honed their craft, they began to develop a sound all their own. Fagen's panic disorder made it difficult for him to front the group in live settings, and financial constraints made extensive touring unfeasible. But these challenges proved a blessing in disguise. Taking a cue from the Beatles' later years, Steely Dan decided to make the recording studio their home. This decision allowed them to perfect their intricate arrangements and complex harmonies, relying on a rotating cast of talented session musicians to bring their vision to life. As Fagen explained in a 1995 interview with Mojo magazine, quote, "The Beatles had not long before set the example of concentrating on records and not touring, and we were arrogant enough to follow their example." The decision paid off. Steely Dan's jazz-infused rock sound began to attract a devoted following, including some high-profile admirers. Even Paul McCartney, a former Beatle himself, became a fan of their work. But as Steely Dan's star rose, they found themselves increasingly at odds with the idealistic message being put forth by another ex-Beatle, John Lennon. John Lennon's post-Beatles activism and Imagine.
Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us.
As Steely Dan was finding its footing in the early 70s, Lennon was embarking on a new phase of his career, one that saw him become as famous for his activism as for his music. Following the Beatles' breakup, Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, threw themselves into the peace movement, staging headline-grabbing events like their famous Bed-Ins for Peace. In 1971, Lennon released what became his most iconic solo work, Imagine. The song, with its simple melody and utopian lyrics, quickly became an anthem for the peace movement. Lennon envisioned a world without countries, possessions, or religion. The type of place where people could live in harmony, free from the divisions that plagued society. Imagine was more than just a song, it was a manifesto. Lennon took every opportunity to spread his message of peace and love, appearing on talk shows and giving interviews where he expounded on his vision for a better world. He saw himself as a voice for change, using his platform as a former Beatle to reach millions with his idealistic message. But Lennon's activism was taking place against a backdrop of increasing social and economic turmoil. In New York City, where Lennon had made his home, the early 70s were a time of crisis. The city was losing manufacturing jobs at an alarming rate, crime was on the rise, and drug use was becoming increasingly prevalent. Between 1969 and 74, New York lost 500,000 manufacturing jobs. 1 million homes depended on welfare, and the murder rate hit a staggering high. It wasn't just New York facing challenges. The Vietnam War was intensifying. The Manson family murders had shaken the nation's sense of security, and income inequality was beginning to widen. The optimism of the 1960s was giving way to a harsher, more cynical worldview. In this context, Lennon's calls for peace and his vision of a world without possessions began to strike some as naive at best and out of touch at worst. While many still found hope and inspiration in his message, others saw a disconnect between Lennon's idealism and the harsh reality of life for ordinary people. Steely Dan's response: only a fool would say that. In 1972, Steely Dan released their debut album, Can't Buy a Thrill. Among its tracks was a song called Only a Fool Would Say That, a direct response to John Lennon's Imagine and his ongoing peace activism. The song, with its upbeat bossa nova groove and seemingly cheerful melody, masked a biting critique of Lennon's idealistic worldview. From the opening lines, Steely Dan takes aim at Lennon's vision. Quote, "Our world become one of salads and sun, only a fool would say that." The song paints a picture of Lennon as an out-of-touch celebrity, contrasting his lofty ideals with the harsh realities faced by ordinary people. The lyrics go on to describe, quote, "A boy with a plan, a natural man, wearing a white Stetson hat," a thinly veiled reference to Lennon, who was often seen wearing a white hat during this period. This image of Lennon as a naive dreamer is juxtaposed against the man in the street who doesn't have the luxury of believing in utopian ideals. Fagan and Becker's critique is particularly pointed when they sing, "You do his 9 to 5, drag yourself home half alive, and there on the screen a man with a dream." This verse encapsulates the disconnect between Lennon's idealism and the daily struggles of working-class people. The song's message is clear. Lennon's call to imagine no possessions rings hollow to those who have little to begin with. Steely Dan suggests that it's easy for a wealthy rock star to preach about abandoning materialism. But for those struggling to get by, such ideas are at best unrealistic and at worst insulting. Only a Fool Would Say That marked a shift in the cultural conversation. It signaled the end of the wide-eyed optimism of the 1960s and the beginning of a more cynical, pragmatic era. Steely Dan was not alone in this critique. Other artists, including Frank Zappa and Paul Simon, also expressed skepticism about Lennon's approach to activism. The song's impact went beyond its critique of Lennon. It established Steely Dan as a band unafraid to challenge the status quo and even take on the biggest names in music. Their willingness to mock a former Beatle demonstrated a level of confidence and irreverence that went on to define their career. Steely Dan's Only a Fool Would Say That stands as a pivotal moment in rock history, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. It challenged the idealism of John Lennon and signaled a new, more cynical approach to music and culture. Meeting John. Cynthia Powell was born September 10, 1939. She had 3 siblings and 2 stepbrothers, Charles and Anthony. Her family was from Liverpool, but it was a frequent target of German air raids during WW2. They had to move to the posh area of Hoylake for their safety. Cynthia showed early promise in the arts. She won a prize organized in a contest by the Liverpool Echo. She was accepted into Liverpool's junior art school a year later. Her father was dying of lung cancer by the time she was 16. He told her she'd have to get a job to support the family instead of going to art school. She decided to rent out a room to 4 apprentice electricians to cover the cost of college. Cynthia started attending the Liverpool College of Art in September 1957. That was where she met John Lennon, when they both attended a calligraphy class together. He was constantly borrowing pens from her because he never had any on him. She also discovered he was only there as a last-ditch option because no other colleges would take him. He'd tease her posh background, but the bud of a romantic relationship was blossoming. He once showed up with a guitar to serenade her with Ain't She Sweet. John first asked Cynthia to go out with him after a college party to celebrate the end of the term. She said she was engaged to a man in Hoylake. He remained persistent, and they began dating. Cynthia officially ended her engagement in autumn of 1958 to start dating John. He also ended a relationship with another student, Thelma Pickles. Dating John. The couple's happiness was often ruined by John's erratic moods. He once slapped her after she danced with Stuart Sutcliffe. Cynthia said, John admits he struggled to be kind to his girlfriends. Tony Bramwell, a close family friend, said it was John's career that helped keep them together. He was insecure, and Cynthia enjoyed being the one to support him and pump him up. They wrote many love letters during the Beatles' first Hamburg residency in 1960. His grandmother and legal guardian Mimi was often a thorn in their side. When her student grant ran out, Cynthia took a job at Woolworths to pay rent. John got £100 that year from his Aunt Elizabeth Sutherland. He went to Paris with Paul McCartney, but she couldn't come with him because she was studying for final exams. John went to Hamburg again in April of 1962. Cynthia discovered she failed her art teacher's diploma exam. Then she got a bigger surprise. Cynthia became pregnant with John's son, Julian. They had never used contraception or talked about it. When she told John, he said, quote, "There's only one thing for it, Sin. We'll have to get married." Marrying into Beatlemania. Cynthia and John were married August 23, 1962, at the Mount Pleasant Register office in Liverpool. Fellow Beatles Paul and George were there, along with their manager, Brian Epstein, who was the best man. The event was a bit of a joke, but they did celebrate later in Reese's restaurants in Clayton Square, where John's parents had celebrated their marriage in 1938. They had no immediate honeymoon because John had an engagement at the River Park Ballroom in Chester that night. They later went to the Hotel George IV in Paris. Brian gave them a place to live and paid for Cynthia's baby to be delivered. Julian was born April 8, 1963. His only condition was that they deny the marriage and pregnancy to maintain the Beatles' major following among young girls. The group denied it when they were publicly asked. They couldn't keep the secret forever, though. Cynthia had Julian christened in November 1963, which John said he didn't want. The media found out and made up stories about his secret wife and son. They even managed to find out where the couple was living. They had a 3-bedroom flat at 13 Emperor's Gate. Fans saw her climbing up the steps and would camp out in the hallways. She and John would have to push through them when they came in or out. They decided to publicly acknowledge the secret when Cynthia joined John on the Beatles' first U.S. tour. He allowed the press to publicly photograph them together, much to his manager's dismay. The fans were even worse in America. Security had to keep an extra close eye on her, as they'd tear off John's clothes and write him desperate love letters. They'd even kick her in the legs, and one who demanded she leave John alone. It was the only time she went on tour with them. Their ski vacations in St. Moritz weren't even safe from Beatlemania. Cynthia, along with George's wife, Pattie Boyd, had to escape dressed as maids. They then got a luxurious house in Kenwood. Cynthia enjoyed entertaining large parties there and raised her son herself. Divorcing John. The first hints of John Lennon's relationship with Yoko Ono came when the Beatles were scheduled to fly to India and visit the Maharishi. Cynthia found letters between them. He denied they were involved and said she was just some, quote, crazy artist. That didn't keep her from continuing to call and visit Kenwood. It was eventually discovered that he was sneaking out every morning to the local post office to see if Yoko had sent him any letters. Cynthia didn't find out about these trips for some time. She unfortunately said, quote, "I had thought our magical interlude with the Maharishi would be the making of our marriage, but in reality, it just presaged the end." On their flight back to England, he got drunk and admitted he'd been involved with several other women during their marriage. Despite never writing any songs for her, he later said he wrote the 1965 song Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, about one of these affairs, but, quote, rendered it in gobbledygook so she wouldn't know. He suggested she take a holiday in Greece while he recorded the White Album. She came home early to find him and Yoko in matching robes on the floor, staring into each other's eyes. John seemed normal when she returned the next day, claiming he loved her more than ever. The story got peculiar again when he went to New York to record with Paul and she wasn't invited. That's when she found out he was planning to divorce her on grounds of adultery, seek sole custody of Julian, and send her back to Hoylake. She was shocked, but began her own divorce proceedings when news of Yoko's pregnancy broke on August 22, 1968. The divorce was granted November 8, 1968. John refused to offer more than £75,000. The final settlement went up to £100,000 and £2,400 annually. It also included custody of Julian. A further £100,000 was put into a trust fund, which Julian would inherit at age 21. His mother would receive the payments until then. The trust was hampered because it provided for any of John's future children. That meant that when Yoko gave birth to Sean Lennon, Julian's inheritance was cut to £50,000. The couple had one final meeting at Kenwood, where she decided to live. He accused her of having an affair in India. One good thing did come out of the mess. Paul visited Cynthia later that year. On the way there, he composed a song in his mind that would later become the Beatles' hit, Hey Jude. It was originally called Hey Jules as a way to comfort Julian. Paul was one of the first people to see and try to cheer up Cynthia, who said, quote, "I will never forget Paul's gesture of care and concern in coming to see us." John Lennon had a fascination with cars that was as eclectic and diverse as his music. While he's often associated with his music and activism for peace and love, his love for cars was a lesser-known aspect of his life. It began early, growing up in Liverpool. As a teen, he was known to tinker with motorcycles, and he eventually graduated to cars as his fame and fortune grew. In the 1960s, during the height of Beatlemania, Lennon acquired an eclectic collection of automobiles that reflected his personality and taste. One of his famous cars was his psychedelic Rolls-Royce Phantom V. In '67, he commissioned his artist friends to paint his Phantom V in vibrant and colorful psychedelic design. More of that in a moment. Lennon's love for cars wasn't about the vehicles only, it was also about the freedom and escape that they provided. In the midst of his hectic life as a Beatle, Lennon found solace behind the wheel, cruising the streets and countryside, often with his wife Yoko Ono by his side. Cars offered him a sense of privacy and autonomy in a world where he was constantly in the public eye. Despite his passion for cars, Lennon was also conscious of the environmental impact of automobile culture. He famously penned the song Drive My Car with the Beatles, which reflected the changing attitudes towards consumerism and materialism of the 1960s. In the years following his tragic death in 1980, his cars have become cherished relics of his life and legacy. Let's take a closer look at some of his famous cars. 1966 Mini Cooper S Radford DeVille. John Lennon's Mini Cooper holds a special place in the annals of automotive and pop culture history. This particular car was a bespoke creation by Harold Radford & Co., a coach-building company based in London. Radford was known for creating luxurious and customized versions of popular cars, and the Mini Cooper S Radford DeVille was one of their most iconic creations. Lennon's Mini Cooper was a unique blend of performance, style, and luxury. The vehicle kept the compact dimensions and nimble handling of the classic Mini Cooper, but featured a host of upgrades and customizations that set it apart from the standard model. Externally, the Radford DeVille boasted distinctive styling cues, including a two-tone paint job, chrome trim, and special badging, giving it an elegant and refined appearance. The car's compact size and sporty proportions made it ideal for navigating the crowded streets of London, where Lennon often found himself during the height of Beatlemania. But it was the interior of the car that truly set it apart. It was outfitted with luxurious amenities, including custom leather upholstery, a wood-trimmed dashboard, and plush carpeting, creating a comfortable and opulent environment for its occupants. Despite its small size, the Radford DeVille offered surprising levels of performance thanks to its potent 1.3-liter engine and lightweight construction. Lennon reportedly enjoyed driving the car around town, appreciating its nimble handling and spirited performance. Mercedes-Benz W123 300TD. John Lennon's Mercedes wagon holds significance not only as a vehicle owned by the legendary musician, but also as an emblem of his practicality and understated style. The W123 series, produced from 1976 to 86, was renowned for its durability, reliability, and robust build quality, making it a fitting choice for Lennon, who valued functionality and longevity in his possessions. The 300TD wagon variant was particularly versatile, offering ample space and utility without compromising on comfort or performance. With its spacious interior and cavernous cargo area, the 300TD wagon was well suited for accommodating Lennon's family and their belongings during their travels. While this Mercedes may not have been as flashy as some of Lennon's other cars, its understated elegance and timeless design appealed to his sensibilities. The car's classic styling, characterized by clean lines and unadorned surfaces, reflected his preference for simplicity and sophistication. The wagon was also praised for its smooth and refined driving experience. Powered by a robust diesel engine, the car offered ample torque for highway cruising, while delivering respectable fuel efficiency, an important consideration for Lennon, who was mindful of his environmental impact. 1965 Ferrari 330 GT. John Lennon's ownership of the 1965 Ferrari 330 GT is a testament to his appreciation for automotive excellence and luxury. The GT was one of the most prestigious and desirable sports cars of its time, renowned for its sleek design, powerful performance, and meticulous craftsmanship. Produced by the legendary Italian automaker Ferrari, the 330 GT exemplified the pinnacle of automotive engineering and design in the mid-1960s. Its curvaceous bodywork, penned by renowned designer Pininfarina, exuded an aura of sophistication and elegance, while its potent V12 engine delivered exhilarating performance on both road and track. Lennon's acquisition of the Ferrari 330 GT in the mid-60s coincided with the height of Beatlemania, a period of unprecedented fame and success for the iconic band. Lennon was no stranger to the trappings of wealth and celebrity, and his ownership of the Ferrari only added to his mystique and allure. Beyond the aesthetic and tactile pleasures, the Ferrari also offered a thrilling driving experience. Its powerful engine, coupled with a sophisticated chassis and suspension setup, delivered dynamic performance and razor-sharp handling. 1965 Rolls-Royce Phantom V. John's Rolls-Royce Phantom V is perhaps the most iconic car associated with him. Purchased at the height of Beatlemania in 1965, this luxurious vehicle became a symbol of his flamboyance, creativity, and penchant for pushing boundaries. The Phantom V was already a symbol of luxury and prestige, favored by royalty, heads of state, and celebrities. But John took his Phantom V to another level by commissioning a custom paint job that transformed the car into a vibrant, psychedelic masterpiece. The design, executed by a team of artists including Steve Weaver and Marika Koger, featured swirling patterns, kaleidoscopic colors, and whimsical imagery reflecting the spirit of the 1960s counterculture movement. His decision to adorn his Rolls-Royce with such a bold and unconventional design was characteristic of his irreverent and rebellious personality. The psychedelic Rolls-Royce quickly became a symbol of the swinging 60s, attracting attention wherever it went and solidifying Lennon's status as a cultural icon. It also had a range of luxurious amenities befitting its VIP owner. The interior had sumptuous leather upholstery, plush carpeting, and state-of-the-art audiovisual equipment, providing a cocoon of comfort and opulence for its occupants. It was more than a status symbol, it was also a means of escape and expression for Lennon. He reportedly used the car as a private sanctuary where he could relax, reflect, and brainstorm ideas away from the prying eyes of the public. The Beatles were the biggest band in the world in the 1960s, and journalists from all over clamored to snag interviews with them. The band was fairly dubious about letting just anyone into their inner circle. There were a few journalists, though, who appeared to pass muster for them. One of these was Maureen Cleave, a writer for the London Evening Standard. The Fab Four felt that Cleave was intelligent and knew a lot about music, and they respected her work. They also liked the fact that she was of similar age to them, making her feel more like a peer than other journalists of the era. Because of the trust, they agreed to let Cleave do a long profile on them. Cleave asked if she could do separate interviews with each of them, and they agreed. She spent time with Lennon and his family at their house in a London suburb. In her article, she wrote about his propensity for staying in, his need for privacy, and his desire to expand his mind. The mind expansion sometimes took the form of taking psychedelics, and other times simply from being a voracious reader. He was particularly interested in books about religion, so eventually they arrived on the topic of religion during the interview. John made a casual reference to the band, and more likely he meant rock and roll music in general being more popular than Jesus. His point was simply noting the decline of the popularity of the church in England and the rise of new forms of worship, if you will. He wasn't alone. Lennon's statement wasn't a particularly incendiary or inaccurate one. At that point, especially in England, the statistics were on his side. Church attendance had fallen off drastically. There were advocates for the church who were making the same case in publications like the Church Times and the Daily Mail, with editorials bemoaning the fact that people weren't attending church anymore. At that point, people associated Christianity primarily with the Church of England, and the Church of England was considered incredibly out of touch with modern times. times and was often mocked by satirists and comedians of the day. And amazingly, clergymen, aware of this issue, actually sought out advice from the Beatles. According to Paul McCartney, they'd get a lot of Catholic priests coming to their shows, and they'd chat with the band afterwards. Paul said they'd complain about how the band drew huge crowds, but the churches were having trouble doing the same. He also said he gave them the advice of modernizing the music they played to appeal to younger audiences. He mentioned adding in more gospel music in particular. McCartney was quick to point out that the band itself was actually quite pro-church. They were happy to help the priests try to find ways to get more people to come to church. So the fact that they ended up being labeled as church haters was bizarre to him. The remark. The remark was not initially even clocked as being anything mildly controversial. It was included in the London Evening Standard article, but wasn't part of the headline, nor did it get any kind of feature in the article itself. As such, it didn't initially cause a stir, but several months later, the article was brought to the attention of Arthur Unger, who ran Datebook magazine. Datebook was far from a stodgy conservative publication, though. It promoted edgy and liberal ideals and had done a fair amount of coverage on the Beatles. The Beatles were actually fans of the magazine, and they'd allowed Unger to join them on tours, given him great access, and generally treated him as an insider. And as he began covering them more and more, he saw the numbers for Datebook go up in big ways. As such, he was always on the lookout for new and interesting ways to write about them. When he read Cleave's piece, he thought it would be perfect for Datebook. He put them on the cover and decided to highlight two particular quotes. One was from McCartney, who said he couldn't respect a country, namely the US, that treated black people so poorly. He used different language that we'll steer clear of, but the sentiment was one of civil rights for black Americans. Unger also included Lennon's quote about not knowing if rock and roll or Christianity would go first. The issue was published July 29, 1966, and the Bigger Than Jesus controversy began. Ban the Beatles campaign. Tommy Charles, a radio DJ in Birmingham, Alabama, was the first to publicly comment on the quote. He was something of a precursor to shock jocks and was always on the lookout for scandals he could talk about. He saw the quote about Jesus and immediately condemned the remark on his radio show. Despite the fact that Lennon wasn't bragging and was actually complaining more about the fact that people weren't going to church as much, Charles saw it as an opportunity to spin it the other way and get a lot of press. He called out for people to ban the Beatles and declared he wouldn't play the Beatles' music on the station. Then Al Ben, who was the manager of the local United Press International, joined the fight. He'd heard Charles's show about the Beatles and agreed with his idea of banning them. He quickly wrote a story about the Beatle boycott, and it got picked up by publications all over the South. Fundamentalist Christians all over decided that the Beatles had positioned themselves opposite Jesus. And given their strong faith, they felt they had no choice but to side with Christ over Lennon. More stations all over the country began to join onto the Ban the Beatles movement, and people also started pulling publicity stunts to cash in on the craze. Charles himself organized for people to mail their Beatles records to the station, where he would grind them up in a tree shredding machine. And this set off many instances of people burning Beatle records, including a giant bonfire started by the Grand Dragon of the KKK in South Carolina. Lennon and the Beatles' response. The Fab Four generally found the whole affair pretty amusing. They knew John wasn't trying to be blasphemous, and he was simply pointing out a basic truth that was evident from the basic numbers. Paul later told a biographer that the band considered it hysterical, low-grade American thinking. And he said the band liked to point out that people had to buy their albums before they could break or burn them. He joked that it wasn't compulsory to listen to Beatles albums after purchasing them, so everyone was free to do whatever they liked with them. Lennon was asked for an apology for the remark, but refused to give one. He said he had forgotten even making the remark, and that it was over and done either way. But the band's manager, Brian Epstein, realized that someone from the band's camp needed to say something. He ended up making a statement of apology to the press that Lennon begrudgingly okayed. In it, Epstein pointed out that the quote has been misrepresented. He reiterated that Lennon had been accurately pointing out the decline in church attendance, especially from youth in England over the last several decades. He also pointed out Lennon was not trying to be boastful about the popularity and status of the Beatles. It was more that their effect was more immediate to members of the younger generation than perhaps the church's was at the moment. Lennon's later takes and his death. John wrote a book called Skywriting by Word of Mouth, and in it he thanked Jesus for the opportunity to get off the road because of the Beatle boycott and return to the recording studio. He felt they achieved more creatively when that happened. And while thanking Jesus in that context might have been tongue-in-cheek, he wasn't by most accounts anti-God or anti-religion. But his beliefs, especially as he got older, did sway more towards atheism or agnosticism. In his first solo album, he had a song where he listed off a bunch of things he didn't believe in, including God. He said he only believed in himself and his wife, Yoko Ono. He wrote that God is a concept by which we can measure our pain. And he famously asked about the notion of no religion in his song Imagine. However, most historians agree that his sentiment in that song was more about peace versus war and how it would be ideal if people didn't fight over spiritual things. So it wasn't anti-religion per se, it was against the idea that people had to kill each other in the name of religion. Lennon was assassinated by Mark David Chapman on December 8, 1980. Chapman had grown angry over what he saw as Lennon's disrespect for God and religion. He later cited the bigger than Jesus quote as one of the reasons he wanted to kill Lennon. His lawyers tried to get him to plead insanity, but he ended up pleading guilty for what he referred to as the will of God. John Lennon's influence. When the Beatles broke up, many music fans felt they would never experience the genius of the Fab Four again. But the four members went their separate ways and all had successful solo careers. John Lennon perhaps became even more iconic than when he was with the Beatles. He became one of the most influential artists while he was still a member of the Beatles, and many of his songs and views struck a chord with the youth from around the world. Among those who didn't care for his music was the US government, and it seems he knew exactly what was happening. But what was so good or bad about John Lennon's music that it upset some people? Perhaps the most famous was his song Imagine, in which he envisions his ideal world. One of the most famous or perhaps infamous lines is when he sings about imagining a world without religion and one where there's no heaven, and above us there's nothing but the sky. While such words may bring solace to some, they bring fury to others. Many didn't like John's overtly atheistic stance, and many saw this as a stance against Christianity. It didn't help that with the Beatles, John Lennon was instrumental in popularizing Eastern spirituality and religion in the West. At one point during the Beatles' fame, John Lennon joked that the Beatles were even more famous than Jesus, which enraged a lot of people. It also got a few concerts canceled. While he was adored by many fans, he had unwittingly made a few enemies as well. While we might think music is simply entertainment, it's important to remember art has a greater influence on our collective psyche. Lyrics from a great song can inspire and influence people, and many others might not be comfortable with how someone might act after hearing a song like Imagine. There were people who felt John Lennon was a dangerous influence on American and perhaps Western society at large. Particularly a small populace of religious fanatics felt truly hurt by Lennon's music and his influence. Among such people, there was one who was previously a huge Beatles fan and a fan of Lennon. He loved listening to Lennon's music and felt joy when he heard it. But he underwent a religious conversion and this time became even more obsessed with John Lennon. He felt John had to be silenced lest he cause even more harm on society. Enter Mark David Chapman. Mark David Chapman was born May 10, 1955 in Fort Worth, Texas. His childhood wasn't easy, and he recalled having horrible experiences with his father, who was physically abusive to his mother and showed no affection towards Mark. This made Mark feel powerless and made him long for power, especially over others. As a teenager, he had a troubled life, often bullied in school. He experimented with drugs and even ran away from home and lived in Georgia for 2 weeks before returning to Texas. When he turned 16, he became a born-again Presbyterian, and this had a major influence on the rest of his life. He found solace in religion and would go around distributing biblical literature, finally finding purpose and a source of strength in life. But his conversion had a darker side as well. It meant Mark was disturbed by anything he considered blasphemous or against the message of the gospel. As a young teen, he, like many teens of his age, loved the Beatles and especially Lennon. But eventually his love for John Lennon turned into hate. He felt John would preach about having no possessions while living as a millionaire. He listened to John's music and feel angry that the singer didn't believe in God and seemed to openly criticize the concept of God and religion in his music. This rage turned into a plan to murder John Lennon. We can't continue without mentioning The Catcher in the Rye. The famous novel was a huge influence on Mark David Chapman, and he often claimed the novel made him want to commit the heinous murder. He felt a kinship with the novel's protagonist, Holden Caulfield. He felt he could live his life as Holden and fight against the quote-unquote phonies, which is often mentioned in the novel. One interesting point that should be noted is that Holden Caulfield also had an aversion to religion and even makes a blasphemous statement about Jesus in the novel. Nevertheless, Chapman loved the book and read it many times. Even after he had done the deed, the police found him sitting down reading it. The Catcher in the Rye was already considered a controversial novel and was now perhaps even more so. He decided to travel to New York where John Lennon lived. He carried along with him a copy of Catcher in the Rye and a .38 Special revolver. The morning of December 8, 1980, the world didn't know who Mark David Chapman was. Since that fateful day, it seems we'll never forget him. How John Lennon lived during his final hours. While John Lennon knew his music upset some people and that he was being surveilled by the government and was even threatened with deportation by President Nixon, his focus continued to be on his music. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was just as busy as ever. He and his wife, Yoko Ono, were finalizing their song Walking on Thin Ice, which would then be released in February of 1981. One of the creepiest things about the recording of that particular song is the lyrics. On the song, Yoko Ono sang about how she might cry someday. Little did she know that she was about to experience one of the most traumatic events of her life. But recording that song wasn't the only thing keeping John busy on December 8th. In fact, even earlier during that day, he was busy giving an interview. He was interviewed by Dave Sholin and Lori Kay. In the interview, he discussed how he was perceived, and this had become a regular theme of his interviews. In fact, only a few days before this interview, he gave another one to Rolling Stone, where he addressed the backlash he faced after the Beatles broke up. He stated that the British public wanted a dead hero, such as Sid Vicious, but he himself refused to become a dead hero. In hindsight, how John Lennon lived during his final hours almost made it seem as if he knew that a great threat was on the way. Around 11 p.m. on December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot and ultimately killed by Mark David Chapman outside of his apartment in New York City. When the police arrived to arrest the killer, he was sitting calmly at the scene reading The Catcher in the Rye. At Yoko Ono's request, all photographs of John Lennon's corpse were destroyed. One wonders how this would play out in the modern age when one can take and share photos in an instant. Mark David Chapman was given a sentence of 20 years to life with possibility of parole. While initially reluctant to speak to the press, he stated that he didn't want to kill John Lennon for the publicity. He has often requested parole, stating that his mental state was weak during the time. However, in 2022, he appealed for parole and stated that he knew killing John Lennon was wrong, but that he did, in fact, desire fame. He was denied parole on the grounds that the world was still recovering from his actions. He's scheduled to appeal for release the 13th time in February of 2024. Now it's time to hear from you. Are you a fan of John Lennon? Did you know about how he spent his final hours and the details leading to his assassination? Let us know in the comments section below.